Okay, so today just a short video which is going to review the class just in general, comparing and contrasting some theories, pointing out a couple of the main authors kind of from the beginning sections that I might ask you to be able to identify in general on a final exam. So in the last video, if you want, you can go back in and on Monday, I did sort of this list of Module 4 topics. I went back through the note set or the slide set that I had posted out of Module 4 and tried to talk about some things that might appear on the final exam if you take that out of there. We finished up with the feminist critiques. I broke them down into the value critique and the representation critique, and I wanted to add here to the representation critique underrepresentation in the profession in general, leading to underrepresentation in models. And it just in general is a critique again on the rational agent, the rational expectation models, and the assumptions in these models as being perhaps not realistic or not accurately describing behavior in the real world. All right, so today just reviewing a couple general ideas, topics from the course. So our main themes in classical versus neoclassical and modern economics. I had a slide sort of like this on the first note set at the beginning of the class. But in the classical economics, you find a lot on survival, economic growth, and behavior as being determined by class or group identity. And then in the neoclassical, or kind of the second half, or maybe second third of the course, we had focus on production methods, market equilibrium, and methodological individualism, which of course means kind of utility and individual utility maximization. So then finally, we presented some modern viewpoints, which were the feminist and environmental approaches, and they sort of borrow from both types of thought. In particular, there's a theme that has been ongoing throughout the class, which is the role of government and the degree to which government should intervene in markets, right? So some different approaches throughout the different kinds of eras and types of economic thought, maybe some different ideas or different focus of the literature, but also some similar focuses, especially on government. All right, we had theories of value out of Smith. You just had labor time and Ricardo being the same as Smith, but you have labor and capital separately. And so the market price or the value at which a item should sell should be in proportion to the labor time that goes into it. And then you have the Austrian theory, which says no, value is actually subjective, what each individual is willing to pay. How does each individual figure out what they're willing to pay? Again, it's subjective on their own preferences. So they figure out their marginal utility from consuming and are willing to pay the value of that marginal utility. All right, and then since then, especially into the feminist and environmental, we have some kinds of critiques of this subjective theory of value. But for the course review, those are sort of the three main theories to focus on. Right, you had utility calculation, methodological individualism. That's out of utility at large is out of Bentham and Mill. So of course in Bentham we had the utilitarian calculus, adding up the sum of pleasures minus pains. And in Mill you find that each individual should have the freedom to pursue this sort of maximization of their preferences. And then the Austrians have sort of next applied this approach, this methodological individualism, value based on individual preference and maximization of individual preference. All right, so I guess I should add here, do I have a note on it later? No, yeah, I have it down here. Okay, so we can revisit that later. The difference between utility and marginal utility. Utility associated kind of here with Bentham and Mill, and then the Austrians use a marginal utility approach. Again, this subjective value, what is each individual willing to pay, the value of their marginal utility, not necessarily total utility. Okay, some theories of capitalism. We spent most of a module here, and then we spent maybe a day or two on some theories of socialism too. So in the theories of capitalism, we had a few authors that fell kind of generally under laissez-faire non-intervention. And the general belief here was that government intervention, federal intervention, would distort price signals in markets, which alters natural business cycles in a way that usually leads to inflation. And so generally non-interventionism here, or free markets, the greatest extent of free markets among all authors that we looked at. We had some limited interventionists, Friedman and the neoliberals. They hold that market freedom is important, but contrary to the laissez-faire Austrians, they think that some intervention is required, just that intervention should be via monetary policy. And that's in contrast to, I guess these are somewhat out of order in the order we studied them. First, we did Austrians and then Keynes, and then critiques of Keynes here. But then Keynes, the neo-Keynesians, new Keynesians all argue that market failures occur, and it's the government's job to identify and intervene to make markets run more efficiently. I also note here that over time, these two schools of thought have come a little bit more close together, with some theory borrowing from kind of both schools of thought. And so the limited interventionists, many of them accept that there is such things as market failures in which the government can intervene and make markets run more efficiently. And there's still debate about the extent or how often that occurs or when government should intervene. Okay, we had a couple of theories of socialism. One out of Marx is alienation. Exploitation leads to workers being alienated from the products, other workers in their own selves or pursuits of passion. So eventually the working class becomes poor and unhappy, leading to revolution. We had a theory of creative destruction, that over time, new, more efficient markets would replace the old ones. And so because of the profit-based structure, the new, more efficient markets are going to be more commonly owned by profitable companies who are able to innovate and invest in new products. And so over time, markets would all tend towards monopolization, and there would need to be some sort of worker ownership of these monopolies, or voter interest in these monopolies. Otherwise, you would just end up in the same world as Marx predicted. So Schumpeter is a Marxist economist, although he was somewhat critical of some of Marx's theories. And then finally, we had a social dividends theory out of Lerner, which is more about economies of scale, noting that there are certain industries which are essential to have, like clean water, drinking water, electricity, sewage, things like that. These industries also benefit from economies of scale. So as the quantity provided increases, the cost goes down. And so there's a cost minimizing motivation towards natural monopoly. Therefore, these industries should be treated as monopolies and then operated by a central authority with profits distributed back to shareholders or taxpayers. I guess I should be clear when I say shareholders here, we don't mean like investors in companies. We mean citizens or taxpayers, because the industries would be publicly owned. Right, so this one, Lerner's theory, may be closest to command, but then the key difference, as we'll note down here, between this theory of socialism, or this type of theory of socialism, and command economy is that you have worker and voter ownership here in socialism, whereas in command economies, you have government ownership and there's no worker or voter interest. Okay, so in general, capitalism, socialism, and command. You have capitalism, a system in which distribution of goods and services determined within markets. We saw a number of schools of thought or views, scholars who view capitalism as the final stage of economic development and disagree about the level of government intervention. So that's kind of where we are here. including Keynes and the neo-Keynesians who want targeted intervention. This is not a theory of socialism, but rather a theory of capitalism, the extent of government intervention within a market-based system, within a free market-based system. Right, you have socialism. In socialism, economically, the distribution of goods and services is still determined within markets, but companies are worker or voter owned. Right, so you can have a certain degree of socialism, and indeed we do. Companies like New Belgium, which are worker owned and operated, and so the workers within those companies have voting interest in the companies and can determine wages, time off, other sorts of policies. Collectively, although each individual worker may not be able to. Right, so economically, that's socialism. Socialism in economics refers most specifically to worker or voter ownership of the means of production. Here in capitalism, we have market system with private ownership of the means of production. In socialism, market-based system with worker or voter ownership. Right, and then we did, I guess in module 3, it would have been, we went a little bit more into detail into capitalism, socialism, and then the critiques of socialism and socialist theories. So communism last, distribution of goods and services are determined by a central authority. Tax rates would be irrelevant here because the allocative and productive decisions are provided within the institution of central command. And so this is just to point out that Keynes, or any theory which describes taxation, is not specifically a theory of socialism or communism. These refer to markets and market structure, more particularly to the ownership of means of production. Here in a command communist economy, the means of production are owned exclusively by the government or central authority. All right, so finally, I have a list of a couple authors, topics, just sort of in general, and this appears as kind of a matching sort of section, and matching the following theories to their most notable authors. So if I say specialization, you should be able to, identify the author who came up with the most closely associated with the theory of specialization, and briefly what it is. So, right, specialization is out of Smith, and it means basically workers each doing a specialized task can together produce a much larger outcome, or that should say output, produce a much larger output than if each worker completed the entire production process individually. Theory of comparative advantage. Ricardo, every producer gives up the opportunity to produce something else when they produce. So each producer should specialize in producing the product such that they give up the least other products in producing. And of course, this is usually expanded into international trade, but Ricardo wrote a little bit on trade that this applies within countries too. You have utility. Bentham and the Austrians, each individual acts rationally by choosing the action which results in the highest subjective pleasure minus pain. And then the idea of marginal utility out of Jevons and Clark, also Menger and the Austrians, which is that we choose the action with the highest marginal rather than total utility, and marginal utility is decreasing in general as quantity increases. So as a result of this, people won't always choose the next item with the highest total utility. If they already have a lot of the item, for example, then the marginal utility of one more would not be very high. They'll choose something with a lower total utility, but a higher marginal utility. Right, finally, we've got aggregate demand, aggregate supply, not testing again on the particulars, but identifying that this is sort of a Keynesian concept, and we can model the equilibrium or the output in an economy, prices and output in an economy in terms of its aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And then the government's purpose is going to be to moderate prices or inflation and quantity, production, or ultimately unemployment, via aggregate demand. Government spending ultimately alters consumption and investment, which are parts of aggregate demand. And so the government's goal is, when the equilibrium is too low, increase aggregate demand to the equilibrium in the long run. If it's too high, decrease aggregate demand. By doing this, government can moderate P and Q, or in other words, moderate inflation and unemployment. All right, so that's gonna be it for this short video. Let me just stop the recording, and then I can answer any questions that are out there for now.